Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Fishel, and this is a special interview with a very special friend of mine from goes all the way back to my Penn State days. And this is Ben Gelber, who has been a meteorologist on WCMH television in Columbus, Ohio, for how many years?
40, almost 44 years.
Okay. So my 37 and a half is no longer impressive at all.
You're just a kid.
That's right. I'm just a baby. But anyways, the reason that we're doing this is that last week when I was up in Ohio for the eclipse, Columbus was obviously, on the way to where I ended up. And since I knew, Ben lived there and worked there, and I hadn't seen him in a long time, that it only made sense to include a visit as part of that trip. So I guess, you just mentioned almost 44 years. What can you speak to in terms of the importance of longevity in one market? Is that a big advantage?
Well, so I've been told that it shows a sense of appreciation, first of all, for where I work, that I have wanted to stay, and that the station, through many different groups, has wanted to keep me in my position. I feel very fortunate and blessed to have been in one market for almost 44 years. From the standpoint of the audience, the feedback I've heard is that they appreciate someone who's been through all these different storms and weather events and can retell the history that they're familiar with, but has also been a participant in community activities and events for the duration. And they know that you wanted to be here uh, because you are still here after so many years. So again, I'm just giving you the feedback that I received. For me, it was an easy decision. Certainly when I started, I didn't think I would last 6 months, let alone over 40 years, because I was so nervous on the air and barely remembered what I said. I think I told you that my first joke, and maybe possibly the first time I ever smiled, back in the era of plexiglass maps and magnetic symbols and magic markers, I hit the weather map a little bit too hard, and down came some of the magnetic temperatures. And I had the good sense to say, well, temperatures are falling in the plains. So that became my first weather dad joke. And then I realized that I could crack a smile on TV and it's okay. So this was a certain number of months into my career. But it takes years, as you know, or even decades to, I think, get comfortable with yourself. You may
Mhm.
know the weather, but I think it's normal to be filled still with some self-doubt as to, how the presentation is going. How good are you? There are some folks, I think, who are certainly, better in front of the camera in terms of, how they present energy. And I'm probably like you, a little more studious, and we weren't really prepared for a career in television necessarily, at least not in our minds. But my goal is to educate and popularize the science field, particularly meteorology. And this is even before we became engaged with discussions on climate change and air pollution and sunspots and solar flares and solar eclipses, all of which fall under the purview of the meteorologist because you become the de facto science reporter.
Right, exactly. And it's gosh, I just had one of those thoughts that raced into my mind and raced out. Oh, uh, the fact that you and I both know people in this field that were literal quote unquote gods in their market, and they were lured away to another bigger market for more money, and for whatever reason, it just didn't work.
Yeah.
And I know I've always thought that if you're lucky enough to find a market where you like it and it likes you, think long and hard before taking off.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think because the kids were young, I didn't want to disrupt school and changing districts and changing cities, and then they eventually reach college age and beyond, and then you realize, do you really want to even attempt to? I can't even imagine being anywhere else. You would lose, not only everybody who's grown up with you literally, but your grounding in events, the climatology, the forecasting, the synoptic knowledge and climatology that you glean from time. And
Mhm.
especially when you found the perfect market. I'm very fortunate not only have had great management over the years, and to have Ohio State University down the street. So I can tap all these climate and meteorology researchers and some other area schools as well, Ohio Wesleyan, Ohio University, and but have these resources at my fingertips to do science stories with some of the best, most well-known climate scientists, especially because climate change, certainly in the last couple of decades, has risen to the top as far as subject matter, but also, having just gone through the total solar eclipse, of which the path of totality, as you know from your travels, went right through the northwest half of our viewing area.
Mhm.
So I had to present any number of science stories, interviewing local astronomers and piecing together our partial eclipse in 2017, what to expect, how we forecast cloud cover and how precarious that can be. It's even tougher than forecasting larger synoptic weather systems. So all of this, I don't think you can get that by bouncing around.
Right.
And I don't know that I was qualified to do that. I think I found my niche and comfort zone, and then as you get older, you really, you start to appreciate, I think, what you have.
Right.
You're not thinking of the future at this point, other than just to keep going. And I'm lucky to be a lecturer at Ohio State every now and then teaching either climatology, meteorology, or synoptic course. So that keeps one foot in the academic world as well.
And I felt the same way that you do. North Carolina State University was literally across the street from the TV station, and uh, I got to know some of the professors. One in particular, Dr. Gary Lackman, who's just been not only a great friend but a great mentor. The things I've picked up from him over the years have been invaluable.
And
Uh,
he literally wrote the book on synoptic meteorology.
yes, yeah, he actually has a textbook that is used at a lot of universities. So
Yes.
now it's funny. I had a list here, but since you mentioned that you're teaching at Ohio State, I'm going to jump topics and then go back. Uh, so obviously you went to Penn State. You're a loyal Penn State fan, and yet you're teaching at Ohio State, and you're living and working in Columbus. How does that play out? I mean, are you able to keep it fun, or does it get a little chippy every now and then? Or
Yeah, always keep it fun. And remember, Penn State didn't come into the Big Ten until 1993.
right?
So it wasn't such a big deal until now. But actually, I felt more included in the football season and basketball season and wrestling, because first of all, I could see Penn State more often now on television now in this era of the Big Ten Network. But I think if anything, it brought me deeper into the market, and it created a very friendly rivalry. But I have found, through all these years, 100% positive feedback. People appreciate and respect you if you respect your school as well as respecting the market.
Mhm.
A lot of my friends, obviously are Ohio Staters, and now I'm teaching at Ohio State. But they often ask me to give perspective when Penn State comes to town or OSU goes to Penn State on sports, that I have to make sure I'm up with things too. But they often ask me for historical notes and or what is a Nittany lion, things like that. So no, actually, I think it has worked out very well. And of course, I highly respect Ohio State on every level. And of course, we more often than not lose in football. So it's a humbling experience, but I think that works out fine. And I think the key is just enjoying the rivalry.
Right, exactly. Um, Now, I guess I'm going to go backtrack here a little bit. Is that when you first started at Penn State, your major was meteorology, right? And you took a little bit of a detour, but ended up in the end where you wanted to be. So can you give us a summary of how all that transpired?
Yeah, I did start as a meteorology major, but ran into challenges. I passed, did very well in the early calculus courses, ran into more trouble down the road and panicked. which is not uncommon when you're 17 turning 18. And I thought I'll never be able to get through some of the higher level math. And I made a couple of turns, um, but I kept my eye on the ball, so to speak. I was just trying to think, was there any other avenue? And I was thinking of teaching and maybe environmental science, certainly related fields. And I had the great fortune to meet with the uh, chair of the geography department and a couple of the professors at Penn State who said who were climatologists, and they said, let's construct a program. Your BS or Bachelor of Science degree would be in geography within the geography department, but your coursework would be split between at least your required courses between geography and meteorology. But the late Dr. Fred Wernstedt designed a program, and he said that was his uh, center of interest. And I grew up just loving climate data, drawing maps, studying, researching historical data for hundreds of years using microfilms and microfiche in the Pennsylvania Poconos. I wound up writing a couple of historical weather books. So essentially how weather affects uh, all of us, not just theoretical meteorology, but what were the impacts of great floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, snowstorms, and also just creating a climatological perspective as far as average temperatures, precipitation, and then looking for the synoptics or the primary features that drive the climate, in this case of Pennsylvania, and more broadly as needed. So, but he was a global climatologist in the sense that he studied world climates, traveled all around the world, wrote books. So he kind of embraced me and he crafted a program. Said you'll come away with a BS in geography, and we'll see where that goes from there. I wasn't thinking television or even I thought maybe
Nor was I.
and maybe for good reason we weren't thinking that, being kind of shy and not the typical television outgoing personalities. So, however, I got an opportunity to go to graduate school at Northern Illinois University and several other locations, but I had the best offer. But I grabbed that because first of all, they were paying for it and they're paying me to teach. So I thought, well, maybe here's an avenue. Um, and and so now I came armed with a lot of physical geography, synoptic climatology courses, synoptic meteorology, and it was interesting again that I was embraced by a couple of professors who astutely figured out where my strengths lay at that time, and they had me make sure I was caught up on all in the very first semester, all the fundamental meteorology courses that I may have had or may not have had, just to make sure everything was good. And then after that, it was all meteorology courses in grad school. Now so the Master of Science degree was meteorology, but within the branch of the geography department at Northern Illinois University. And as luck would have it, they had a cable TV station for student journalists, and they had weather people, but somebody left, and somehow the professors recommended me as to pick up the weather that last semester. I was scared to death, and I owned one suit at the time, which was seen a lot. And it wasn't all that TV friendly, but let's face it, it was the late 70s,
Right.
and with the lapels and the gauche colors, and but as it turned out, that I made a tape, and I started while I was trying to figure out what I would do after I finished grad school, which was months away. I made those old 3/4 inch tapes and answered the call. And fortunately, there were a couple of others who were doing the same thing. So we kind of learned together how to put ourselves out there. And lo and behold, TV stations were sending me letters. Back then, there was no email or reels.
Right.
And I had some job interviews. I thought, well, we'll just see where this goes. And I had two job offers, one in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the other here in Columbus. And the chief meteorologist talked my ear off and convinced me. He said, "You'll have more airtime here to bigger market. We'll get you up and rolling. And main thing at that point said, we don't doubt your knowledge or communication skills. It's just getting used to being on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And of which I don't know how else to describe it. You just have to do it. Now, see, young people today, with various means of putting together reels on Instagram or Facebook Live, I think are already coming ready and prepared to broadcast. We didn't have any of that.
Right.
We just kind of fumbled our way through and had to learn to be on television and get used to talking to an audience. I think we had the skills to ad lib about meteorology, but we didn't have theater courses, and it was a challenge to get through stage fright
Mm-hmm.
and many other things, and self doubt again as to whether I even should be on television. But the next thing you know, time flies, and you get settled in the market, and obviously consultants come and go, and news directors, but they were all very supportive,
Mm-hmm.
and they stressed credibility. We came in at the right time because technology was just coming to the fore. We were suddenly going from still radar and satellite graphics to primitive animation and a smattering of color.
Well, and wasn't that also the time that television stations were adopting a new approach that instead of having weather announcers, they actually wanted a degree meteorologists, and
Right.
we couldn't have timed that better if we had tried.
Right, because we grew up in a world where it was rare to have an actual meteorologist,
Right.
and maybe in the bigger markets you had one,
Mm-hmm.
um, but not certainly not everybody the way things are, or almost everybody the way things are framed today. But and you're right, when we came in the early '80s, there was this big push to actually have a scientist doing the weather. What a
Mm-hmm.
concept! In other words, moving it out of the entertainment world. But part of it also was driven by the fact, back then it was magic marker and plexiglass and happy talk, which was actually a thing back then. In other words, making anchors more personable. But suddenly technology, limited as it was introduced into the mix, and you needed a science person with credibility to start to explain. And
Mm-hmm.
especially when one station had a scientist, that being a meteorologist, then you would see the other two follow suit. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what happened very quickly through the '80s. So you're right, we came in at the right time, and then we watched the arc of technology grow to include Doppler radar and animated satellite imagery and jet streams instead of drawing them. We could connect the dots, showing models on the air instead of just maybe creating a single map, a projection of what might happen. The world has changed so much,
Oh my God.
and we are talking 40 years.
Right. And I need to give you an assist in the development of my career because my first job out of Penn State was in Chicago, which was only about an hour east of Northern Illinois.
Right.
And I found out that you guys had a cable station and that you did a 30-minute newscast Monday through Friday. And I remember you told me one day, it's like, well, just come over here after work and we'll help you make a tape. And I think I stood in front of one plexiglass map of the United States for 3 minutes, made up a fictitious East Coast snowstorm, and sent it off. And son of a gun, the general manager at the station in Maryland was dumb enough to hire me.
And the rest is history, as they say.
That was just amazing. I want to. Can you mention the title of both of your books, so in case anybody's interested, that they can look that up on Amazon?
Yeah, the very first book was simply called Pocono Weather, subtitled A History of the Weather of Eastern Pennsylvania, Northwest New Jersey, kind of a local book where I grew up, the northeast corner of Pennsylvania, but taking it back all the way to the 1800s, beyond climatological data as we know it now, and finding some newspapers and journals to get back into the 1800s. Well, one thing led to another, and that interested Rutgers University Press. And in 2002, I published a book for the entire state called the Pennsylvania Weather Book. One surreptitious finding of many was that when I was in high school, my best friend, his mother was a nurse, brought me. For some reason, I tagged along to a family in town in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, and I have no idea why I was doing it, but I perused a box, and inside the box was a set of weather records. by a family member many generations back who had kept weather records in the middle and late 1800s and early 1900s and periodically was quoted in the local newspaper.
Hmm.
How I came to find that, why I was even in somebody's box of data, maybe the family had, directed me to that. I don't recall, but it seemed more than coincidence, which then his records were then introduced in my book. And there are a lot of strange coincidences like that that I thought, well, maybe my job is to give the light of day to historical weather observers who just mailed in their records to the old U.S. Weather Bureau. And yeah, it was published that, only a few scientists probably saw, and that was the end of it. Well, I'm looking at all these old manuscripts. Of course, now it's all on computer of people who had backyard weather stations like we do today, but they weren't electronic. You had to go out into a big white box with slats and read the equipment every day, and you had to go out in the elements, whether it was 0 or 100, and then measure the rain and snow. Well, they were doing all this back in the 1800s, just like we are now, except we have some major advantages. So all this became all these stories, and then the newspaper accounts took me back from the network of data in the 1900s back into the Smithsonian Institution uh, record of observers back through and prior to the Civil War. And then I continued research and books and a lot, countless hours, hundreds of hours in libraries, hoping to find that nugget. And I would find it in somebody's history of this county or that county. And that led to a redevelopment, essentially a rewrite of the 2002 book, which hopefully will be out in the next year or so, Pennsylvania Weather 400-year comprehensive study. So now I'm taking us back to settlement times.
Mm-hmm.
The earliest observers, the European observers who even jotted anything down about the weather. A Dutch explorer, for example, going up, trying to get up the Delaware River. William Penn's comments about the weather and climate. But I also discovered that there is a keen interest in the weather and climate of early America, including by our founding fathers. And that became an op-ed for the New York Times called Ben
Wow.
Franklin Global Warming, which is easy to look up with that title, which I wrote November 17th of 2009, or that's when it was published. But it turned out that our founding fathers and scientists of the day were having an argument about climate change. What's old is new. The key difference, as I point out to my students, they weren't arguing over carbon dioxide. There would be another more than a century, I think, before scientists began to look into greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide as a source of potential future warming. Now, it was based on land use, which still is very important. It's often ignored in the climate change discussion, but it's right up there with greenhouse gases. But back then, they were arguing clearing and cultivation had altered the climate. In other words, making the weather more extreme. Just like today, we're
Right.
talking about climate change and warming and more water in the atmosphere. But they were discussing, deforestation and changes in essentially what we call albedo or reflectivity, changes in the distribution of moisture, affecting storms and wind. I mean, it was fascinating. So this opened up a whole little sidebar for me, and that led to the article I wrote. But the key is the arguments weren't being conducted in a public arena as we know it today.
Right.
Obviously, there's no Facebook back then,
Hmm.
but these were the best and the brightest, the Thomas Jefferson, Noah Webster, dictionary fame. These, Ben Franklin, of course, physicians of the day, like Dr. Benjamin Rush, who treated the yellow fever epidemic victims in the early 1790s. They had these debates and they didn't agree. Some actually blamed the memory of the oldest inhabitants, as they were called, that the memories were faulty. And it's true, we tend to, bunch the cold, snowy winters together and forget about the warm ones in between.
Right.
But oh, when we were growing up, going to walking to school and drifting snow uphill both ways, and so the point was by some of folks that you couldn't rely on the old timers. You could rely on them for their memories, but it was not all that as scientific. But the problem is there was essentially no weather data to work with. A journal here, diary there. And so no less than Thomas Jefferson proposed, countywide or, a network of weather stations by county and getting instruments out. And eventually that would happen. He envisioned a network that would come to fruition, in later decades. And Smithsonian Institution was behind that. But even prior to that, the forts on the frontier, so to speak, including the Ohio country, were outfitted with some basic weather equipment, and the physicians, who were the scientists, were told to keep records. Fort Defiance in Northwest Ohio is one example. And as one climatologist wrote, well, yeah, the data, may be somewhat questionable, but they knew which way the wind was blowing. And so he took measure of how many days, for example, the wind was blowing out of the northwest then, and then looked at modern data and was able to determine we had a more predominantly northwesterly flow during what is and was part of the Little Ice Age that ended in the mid to late 1800s. And that corresponded with some of the very early temperature records. But I was lucky to find some good data from Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, some records kept by high school teachers and college professors, records from at Gettysburg College during the Battle of Gettysburg. Wherever I found something, I crammed it in there, and put good sourcing so others can find out what I found. And obviously, I can only go into so much detail. I'm trying to cover 400 years of weather,
Right.
roughly from 1620 to 2020, give or take. But to me, it's endlessly fascinating. But my focus, again, going back to my geography days, human geography also, is what were the impacts, not just a recitation of, which I do plenty of, rainfall stats and snowfall stats, and how we know the winters, and I could show this, have warmed, and this is another good point. For those who might ask, well, the history's fun, but why does it matter? Well, it matters because if we're going to have a discussion of climate change, we can't just look at the last 10 years or the last 30 years.
Right.
You've got, as far as the timeline can go that records allow, you've got to extend it. And I was able to show that we had some very warm decades prior to a mid 20th century cooling pattern. And they produced higher temperatures than we see today, but that was also during an arid or relatively dry period, the Dust Bowl. And some of that was due to land use, as we know, overgrazing and of cropland in the plains. Anyway, all of this to me is interesting, and I think that if we're going to talk about these are the worst floods or snowstorms we've ever seen, well, are they? Let me go back and show you what happened in 1920 or 1870 or 1820, and quantify within reason as best we can. Now, one conclusion I'm able to draw, though, is that we've had massive snows and heat waves, cold waves, floods, and drought since day one. However, I look for, are we seeing more of? In other words, a clustering of events that might defy simple stats. And that can happen also in the 1800s. There was a very wet cycle in the early 1880s that resembled the 1990s in Pennsylvania. And out here in Ohio, there were numerous floods on the Ohio River and tributaries. But, an example would be, in my view, and I show correctly, I believe, we've had an uptick in the number of large mid-Atlantic snowstorms, that have reached the coastal plain, unlike anything that we've seen in the past. Not that we haven't seen the incredible snowfalls, whether it's in the nation's capital, New York City, or Philadelphia. We've just seen more of them.
Well, and then people will make the argument that, well, we're getting more snow, so how does that mesh with with global warming? And of course, as well or better than I do, is that as long as you're cold enough to snow, the more moisture you have in the air, the more potential there is for greater amounts. And so it's not inconsistent at all to have.
So instead of 28 and snowing heavily, it's 32 and snowing heavily.
Right.
But like you said, a warmer Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico means you can essentially squeeze out more moisture or precipitate more. And on top of that, and some climatologists adhere to this, I know it's not written in stone is that the jet stream may be a little wavier,
Hmm.
and storms may be moving a little more slowly. We know hurricanes and landfalling storms definitely are, and they produce more precipitation. So we're seeing deeper systems. Not that we had the blizzard of 1888,
Right.
1999, and all of that. But so it's more, are we having, more maybe instead of once every 25 years, were we seeing a clustering of storms as we saw in February of 2010, for example? We're seeing places like New York and Philadelphia rewrite their all-time snowfall records more than once over in the
Hmm.
past decade or two. Or as I discovered, half of Philadelphia's large snows, we'll say 12 inches or more, have occurred since the late 1990s, with records going back into the 1880s. So I think that's where the history intersects with climate discussion. It doesn't take away from any of the conclusions. And in fact, when you take a station, and here's another point I make, it has to be apples to apples. We had stations move from downtown to airports, and not to mention changes in urban environment. So
I just want to give you a warning here. I just got a little thing popped up that we got 3 minutes and 50 seconds left.
I'll
What,
let you finish up. But it's key not to, to know the quality of your data. Even if the
right.
data are accurate, is it really apples to apples, or did the environment change around the weather site
Hmm.
before you assume that temperatures have risen or fallen?
Right. And you know that I was a skeptic for a long time, and I came to the conclusion that I was allowing my political ideology at the time to dictate my opinion about a science issue, which was not cool at all. And so, people say, well, what was it that changed your mind? It wasn't any new data. It was a realization that my thinking was flawed, and to have to come to what the acceptance of that and so forth. But just the other day, I saw a post on Instagram where somebody was just making total fun of the whole climate change argument, that it's a religion, there's nothing to back it up. And one of the people on that thread said, well, we all know it's the Earth's distance from the sun that dictates our temperature. And obviously, he didn't know that we're actually closer to the sun in January and farthest away in July. And it's the angle at which the sun hits us that gives us our seasons. And I guess this is what really bugs me, is that with social media now, you have these people that are pontificating as experts when they don't even know fundamental science. And they apparently don't care to take the time to learn it. And so it ends up, misleading an awful lot of people. And it's great concern to me.
Right, and also it has no business being a political football.
Right,
Science should be left to science, and scientists are not above criticism or biases. We're all human,
right,
and you and I are very, I think, humble in our views, that we want to hear views that differ, and there is plenty of room for that. And I don't subscribe to the view that everything that happens is climate change or human induced climate
right,
change, because my master's thesis was on solar activity and
right,
solar cycles and sunspots playing a role in, and it had a pretty good match in terms of where you were in a 22-year sunspot cycle and weather. And it's, in other words, natural causes, it's not mutually exclusive. You can have both natural causes and cycles, but perhaps amplified to an arguable degree in human activities. In other
mhm,
words, are we stepping on the accelerator just a bit on what would be an otherwise warmer cycle anyway, but it's now that much warmer? And I know,
right,
and that's a complex debate, but I certainly entertain opposing views, provided that those views come from people with a modicum of science background. Not
right.
that we have all the answers. In fact, we've talked many times about expressing uncertainty and the willingness to acknowledge limitations and to understand all different points of view. But it has to be, as you said, based on credible science
Right.
and physics.
I'm going to need to cut us off here. There were a whole bunch of other things I wanted to get to. We're just out of time, but
There could always
well,
be a part two down the road if the
that's
ratings
right.
are high enough. So
We can do a sequel. But Ben, thanks a million for making time for me here. And I know
thanks,
that
Greg.
my subscribers are going to enjoy listening to you and everything you had to say. So take care, and hopefully we'll see each other soon.
Great. Have a good week, Greg.
All right. See you later.